Today we're going way back in time
Way, way back.
to the 15th century
That's right.
to dive into a book called The Perfumed Garden.
Interesting title.
It is an interesting title because it's actually
It's not about gardening.
it's not about gardening.
No, not about.
It's an Arabic sex manual.
It is, and this is one of those sources that I think a lot of people might initially dismiss and say, well, what can we really learn from this?
Right.
What could they possibly have known back then
Right.
about relationships, intimacy?
And why should we care?
Yeah, why should we care?
500 years later.
That's right.
But it turns out it's a really interesting window into a particular time and place, and we can learn some interesting things about the past from it.
And ourselves, I think, in looking at how different things were, and yet how some of the things that they talk about, we might still see echoes of today.
Yeah, and I think as listeners know, one of the things we really try to do on this show is bring you a variety of sources and a variety of different kinds of sources because
Absolutely.
there are so many different places where we can learn
That's right.
about history.
And that's one of the things I love about this deep dive is that we do use such a variety of sources to get to these really interesting historical narratives.
Right. And this is a great example of that.
Yeah.
The excerpts that we're looking at are specifically focused on what the author considered,
Praiseworthy
yes,
in men and women. So
and men and women,
what made a man, particularly,
the good man.
yeah, a praiseworthy man or a woman, a praiseworthy woman.
Right.
And this is where it gets, I think, really interesting.
Yes. And so we should probably talk a little bit about the author himself before we jump into that.
Yeah, so the author is Sheikh Nafzawi, and we're actually looking at a translation of this text that was done by Sir Richard Burton in 1886.
Okay.
So quite a while ago, but Burton, in his notes, speculating on who Nafzawi was,
Right.
really paints a picture of him as a scholar,
Okay.
as somebody who is probably trying to advise people on relationships, on intimacy,
Within the context of his time.
within the context of his world and his culture.
Right. And as we're about to see, those ideals were very, very specific.
They were.
And maybe not something that we would necessarily
If aspire to today.
aspire to today.
Yeah.
But Burton also notes that there are some really interesting omissions in this text.
Yes.
Like, there are certain sexual practices that were common in other cultures at the time that Nafzawi doesn't talk about at all.
So it makes you wonder why.
Yeah, what was his...
What's going on there?
Yeah, what was going on there? What were the lines that even he was drawing?
Right. Even in a text about intimacy,
Exactly.
there are still boundaries
Yeah.
that he's setting.
So why should we care?
Right.
Like,
Why should we care?
500 years later, what does this tell us about history?
Well, it gives us this really unique perspective into the past, right? Because by going back and looking at the ideals that they had, the expectations that people had for each other and for relationships, we can start to understand how these beliefs about love and relationships and desire have changed over time, right? Or in some cases, maybe haven't changed as much as we think they have.
Right.
So it's a way to look back and see how we get to where we are.
So let's jump into those ideals a little bit. Let's start with men. What in 15th century Arabia did it take to be...
To be considered a praiseworthy man.
Yes.
Well, the real key is virility.
Virility.
That's it. You know,
Yeah.
this idea of physical presence, of stamina, of just embodying this kind of sexual prowess.
So the ideal man was like a conqueror almost.
Yes, very much so. It was about, taking charge in the bedroom, being able to, they talk about things like being able to delay gratification, but also being very much in control of the situation.
So very different from how we might describe an ideal partner today.
A little bit different, right?
Where we...
Maybe not quite so much emphasis on those particular qualities
Right.
today.
What about women?
Women, very different story here.
Okay.
Here, the emphasis really shifts from power to pleasing.
Okay.
The praiseworthy woman is beautiful, she's graceful, she's submissive. Her purpose is for her husband's pleasure and hers alone.
So very much.
Very different.
Defined in relation to...
Absolutely.
Right.
In relation to a man, and specifically her husband.
Right.
And no one else.
Right. And it's interesting, too, because it's this real dichotomy between the man who's supposed to be powerful and
Yes.
in charge and almost like a force of nature.
Yes, very much so.
And the woman is meant to be acted upon.
Right, and to please and to be subservient in a lot of ways.
So clearly these descriptions weren't just about physical attributes. We're talking about larger societal
Lower dynamics, absolutely.
dynamics at play.
Yeah, this is reflective of the broader culture.
And it makes you wonder if there were even any real people who could live up to these.
Oh, absolutely not. These were aspirational ideals.
Right.
I mean, think about it.
this is the ideal.
Yeah.
This isn't the reality.
Exactly right. So these were, the things that maybe people were striving for or that they were told to strive for.
But whether or not they were achievable by anyone
Right.
is a different question.
Is a very different question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're already starting to see some really interesting things here. But to get to maybe even more interesting.
To get to the good stuff.
Yeah. What are the good parts? What's the really fun stuff in this book?
So the Perfumed Garden is more than just a list of qualities.
Right.
It actually includes stories as well. So it has these narratives woven into it. And we're going to look at two of them.
Okay.
In particular, the first involves this imposter prophet.
An imposter prophet.
I know how intriguing is that his name is Mo Ilama.
Mo Ilama.
And he is vying for power with this prophetess.
So a battle of the prophets.
Yes, exactly. A battle of the prophets. Her name is Cheja.
Cheja.
And it's not all, theological debate.
I was going to say, I bet it's not.
No.
I bet there's more to it.
There's a lot more to it.
And that.
A lot more to it.
Okay.
And one of the things that takes center stage in this story is perfume.
Perfume.
Which in this context is being used very much as an aphrodisiac.
Oh.
And a tool of manipulation.
I mean, that makes sense, right? Because we know even today, scents have a certain power.
Huge power. I mean, just think about how certain smells can evoke memories or, elicit certain emotions.
Right.
So in this case, perfume is not just about smelling nice.
Right.
It's about power.
It's about getting what you want.
Absolutely.
So how does Molama use perfume to battle this prophetess?
Well, you're going to have to wait to find out about that.
Oh, no.
But let me just say it's a very strategic blend of fragrances.
Okay, all right. So we'll have to come back to that.
Yes.
But you said there were two stories.
Yes. The second one involves a court jester.
A court jester.
His name is Balun.
Balun.
And he's a recurring character in The Perfumed Garden. And this particular story sees him pitted against Vizier's wife.
And for those of us who aren't familiar with what a vizier is.
A vizier is basically like a high-ranking political advisor. So this woman
has some power.
She's got some power.
Okay.
Her name is Hamdana, and the story revolves around this golden robe.
A golden robe. Okay.
And we see Balul using all of his cunning to kind of navigate the situation. And it exposes a lot of the hypocrisy and desires that are kind of bubbling under the surface of this very, rigid society.
So a jester outsmarting someone in a position of power.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, we see this trope a lot.
We do.
Throughout history, right?
The court jester is always wiser than they appear.
And they use that wit to their advantage.
Right.
So it's fascinating to see how Nafsawi uses that here to kind of comment on the power dynamics of his own time.
I love that.
Yeah, it's a great story.
It sounds like something straight out of Shakespeare.
It does. Doesn't it just set in 15th century Arabia instead of, Elizabethan England?
Right.
But yeah.
This is fantastic. I can't wait to hear more.
I'm ready to jump into these stories. It really makes you think about how much has actually changed.
Right. Like on the one hand, we've obviously made progress in terms of women's rights, gender equality.
Yeah.
But then you read something like this and you think, are we really that far removed from
I know, it's interesting.
Some of these ideas?
It is, because, when you think about the world that's presented in The Perfumed Garden,
right,
it's a world where women are very much confined to the domestic sphere.
Right.
Their lives are really centered around, pleasing their husbands.
Right. Their value is defined by their relationship to men.
By their relationship to men and by how desirable they are to men.
Right.
And that's a very different world than the one we live in today. At least in many places.
In theory.
In theory.
Right.
Yes.
But don't you think that there are still some echoes of those ideas?
I think you're absolutely right, and I think it's really subtle, too.
Yes.
It's not always overt. It's not always...
Right. No one's saying this outright, but it's...
Those expectations are still there.
There's like underlying...
Yes, very much so. I mean, we still, for example, place a lot of emphasis on women's appearance.
Yes.
On beauty, on attractiveness, and...
And men are still often judged
by their ability to provide... To be the breadwinner.
Yes.
To be successful in those very traditional masculine ways.
Right. And so it's like, even though we can look at this text and say, oh, well, that's obviously...
Outdated. Right.
It's not like we've completely...
Escaped it
either.
No.
And maybe by looking at it, we're more aware of it.
I think that's exactly right, because it allows us to see those patterns, those ingrained ideas that maybe we don't even realize are still influencing.
Right. And that actually reminds me of the story of the Jester Balul and the vizier's wife.
Yes.
Because in a way, she is.
She's powerful.
She's in a position of power.
But she's still limited by
Right, but she's still
the expectations of her society.
limited by these societal expectations.
Exactly.
And her desires are still...
And her desires are still framed in terms of what is acceptable for a woman of her station.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which I think is really interesting.
It is, and it's this reminder that these power dynamics are often more complicated
Yes.
than they appear on the surface.
Than they seem.
Yeah.
Right.
And even within a society that might seem very rigid and structured,
Right.
there's room for subversion. There's room for, manipulation. There's room for all of these things to kind of
Things to get a little messy.
and for those boundaries to be tested.
Right. And I think that's one of the things that I really appreciate about the Perfumed Garden is that it
doesn't shy away from that complexity.
It doesn't shy away from that complexity. And it also, it shows us that a book that is ostensibly about, drill and seduction can also be about
Oh, absolutely.
much bigger things.
It can be about power. It can be about, social dynamics. It can be about all of these things that we might not expect from a text that's focused on intimacy.
Yeah. It's like we've been saying.
You have to look beneath the surface.
You have to look beneath the surface.
You can't just take it at face value.
Right. Because even a story about a golden robe
Right.
can tell us something really profound.
Exactly.
Right.
And I think that's why these stories that are embedded within the text are so valuable, because they give us these little windows into the lives of people from another time and place, and they allow us to see how
they navigated
these issues that are still relevant to us today.
Yeah.
These are issues of power and desire and social standing and ambition.
How little those things have really changed.
And how those things transcend time and culture.
It's amazing.
It's amazing to see those parallels.
It really is.
Between, 15th century Arabia and
the first century.
the world we live in today.
Yeah. And who would have thought that we would find those parallels
It's not exactly
in an Arabic sex manual?
the first place you would look
Right?
for these kinds of insights.
But here we are.
And I think it speaks to the fact that, we can't
We
can't just dismiss sources out of hand.
be open to
We have to be open to finding
information
finding wisdom
in unexpected places.
Exactly.
It's amazing to me how a book that's, over 500 years old can still feel so relevant.
And it's not just relevant. It's like it sparks all these other questions, and it makes you think about things in a different way.
Yeah, and I think that's the beauty of history,
Absolutely.
right? Is that it's not just about the past. It's about...
It informs the present.
It informs the present. Exactly.
And hopefully the future.
Yeah, so if we were to kind of bring it all back,
Yes.
what can we take away
I'm afraid.
from the Perfumed Garden?
What can we take away from the Perfumed Garden? Well, I don't think any of us are going to be, rushing out to apply 15th century dating advice.
Probably not.
Although, who knows? Maybe there's some hidden gems in there.
You never know.
But I think the real value is using it as a lens for self-reflection, right? So looking at these ideals, these expectations, even though they're from another time and another place, and saying, okay, how do those connect to the beliefs that we hold today?
Right. Or how have they
influenced
in ways we don't realize?
The way we think, even if it's subconscious.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's not about saying, oh, these are good things or bad things. It's about saying,
Right.
these were the beliefs that shaped this society.
Right.
And how do those beliefs
Echo
into our world today?
And I think what I really appreciate about it is that it makes those echoes more visible.
Because sometimes
So they're hidden.
they're very hidden.
And we don't even realize.
And it's not like we're consciously thinking these things a lot of times.
No, it's like this underlying
There's this
cultural baggage that we all carry around.
Yes. And by looking at a text like this, we're kind of unpacking
Yes, unpacking that baggage.
some of that baggage.
And becoming aware of it.
Yeah.
Which I think is so important.
Absolutely.
Huh.
And, speaking of things that help us unpack,
Yeah.
those stories that are in the Perfumed Garden.
Oh, those stories are fantastic.
I love how those kind of...
They're like these little...
They give us like a little...
vivid example.
A little side door.
Side stories that kind of bring it to life.
Another aspect of this world.
Exactly, because we see how these ideals play out in these little narratives.
Yeah. Like
with real characters.
Moilama and Cheja.
Yes.
The imposter prophet.
A perfume.
Using perfume
as a weapon of seduction.
Like ambition and...
Oh, it's all there. Wrapped up in this
power.
Beautiful bottle of fragrance.
And then with Balul.
Oh, Balul.
And Hamdana.
Outsmarting.
The vizier's wife.
You don't always expect the jester to come out on top.
You don't, but in this case,
yes,
he uses his wit.
He does.
To his advantage.
And I think that's a good lesson for all of us.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah.
Sometimes it's the people you least expect.
Sometimes the people we least expect.
Who have the most power.
Have the most power or...
the most wisdom.
Or the most wisdom, yes. It seems like.
Yeah.
Ultimately...
If there's one thing...
If there's one thing we can learn...
We can take
along our deep dive.
From the Perfumed Garden.
Today.
It's that we should never judge a book by its cover.
Right. Or by its title in this case.
Or by its title, exactly.
Because you never know what you might find.
You never know what hidden gems are in there.
Hidden gems, exactly. This has been the deep dive.
Until next time.